Hi guys. So my presentation, The Exclusion of Inclusion, is based off the podcast with Professor Gary Hornby. So I will touch briefly on inclusion, the goals of an educational system, current research in the area, the conclusions that I've drawn from this, and then the questions. So we're all relatively familiar with the road so far. Students with special needs were outright excluded from the educational system. Then, with a lot of work from parents, advocates, teachers, etc., there was a segregated system developed where special schools were rife. In more recent times, this has progressed to an integrated system with autism units in mainstream schools, resource teachers, etc. And now, with the ratification of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, there is a push towards full inclusion, as this is the only way in which children can no longer be discriminated in an educational setting based off a disability. So, a key aspect that needs to be explored is what do we want from our education system? Further education opportunities, employment preparation, life skills, a combination of any of the above. So research done by Professor Hornby and Professor Kaufman brought up some interesting aspects talking about the inclusive vision versus the special education reality. So they state there is a lack of research evidence supporting full inclusion, the reality of a limited education system as opposed to the limitless system that is so commonly talked about by advocates of full inclusion. They argue that special education needs further development and implementation, that those who aren't advocates of full inclusion are labelled pariahs, and as a result, there's a lack of willingness to debate the rush towards full inclusion. Another aspect why full inclusion has gained so much momentum is the disdain held for old 20th century thinking in the area. There were some aspects of the article that I took slight grievance with, where it was stated that people went along with full inclusion for personal gain. This is kind of worrying if it's right or wrong. If it's a wrong statement, it's kind of just a shot at academics in the field. And if it's correct, it's far more worrying because then you have people espousing the benefits of full inclusion who aren't actually advocates but only got in it for themselves. The unknown future opinions was used as an argument against current research in full inclusion, stating that if people look back now and say, oh, full inclusion, that was wrong 50 years from now, where would that leave us? As people who are followers of full inclusion are chasing the impossible dream where everything's available. And also, they stressed an argument against this was the difficulty in teaching students with severe multiple disabilities in a mainstream setting. I disliked this purely based off the fact that something being difficult doesn't mean, especially in this setting, that it isn't worth doing. So there was some arguments in agreement with Professor Hornby and Professor Kaufman, which stated aspects like mainstream teachers aren't equipped or trained sufficiently, and that the full inclusion model and ideology only gained momentum due to laws as opposed to evidence saying that it works. Another aspect in more recent times is the data collection that's done on students by teachers and then educational bodies, which can increase the pressure on teacher performance. And there's a belief held that in a situation where children with special needs are in mainstream classes, there would be a rush on behalf of teachers to sort of have a label put out there that poor academic performance is due to X, Y, and Z, as opposed to it actually being someone's fault. So the arguments for full inclusion, though, note how education serves as a microcosm of society, where if we want to get society to a stage where people with disabilities aren't sidelined, that we have to first show that in an educational setting. Also, when lack of empirical data is used as a stick to beat the full inclusion model, it was interesting that I found this piece which showed that students with special needs in mainstream education graduate more frequently from high school and have a lower dropout rate than students with special needs in segregated settings. This obviously has myriad benefits for like job prospects, quality of life, etc. There's also a piece from New Zealand which showed that the push for high quality instruction and flexibility to meet student needs had profound benefits, as well as a willingness among teachers and educational staff to support individual education programs. And this was a really interesting study because it spoke to all the people who have a voice. It spoke to the children, spoke to parents, spoke to special education coordinators, teachers, principals, etc. So when I first listened to the podcast, the tide of full inclusion in Ireland was something that kind of gripped me strongly. We got the Chaucer quote, "Time and tide wait for no man." And this worried me because when I came into this, I shared the same opinion as Professor Hornby that the fact that we don't have a system in place that can cater for everyone in mainstream education is a reason for why special schools should be retained. But as I've done more research and read a bit more into it, I've actually flipped and don't believe anymore that the fact that we might be wrong or the fear of failure, as I put it here, is a reason for us not to try. Like the Irish educational system has been failing people for since its inception, really. And the fact that we don't have a perfect system in place isn't a reason for us not to try to have a perfect system in place. Another point that I'd like to make is, do we have to accept limited? If full inclusion likes a limitless model where teachers are trained to the correct levels and there is enough support in place to be flexible and meet the IEPs of students no matter what their needs are, doesn't that sound like something that we should be pushing for? Thanks, guys. That's pretty much me out. So I now will take some questions.